Today's webinar is How In-House Counsel Can Identify Key Negotiating Points in AI Technology. It is presented by Michael Haynes. Michael is the general counsel at Juro, bringing over a decade of legal expertise to the team. Since joining in 2022, Michael has led Juro's legal functions, supporting the platform's mission to empower businesses with intelligent contract automation. As a two-time customer prior to joining Juro, Michael occupies a key role in helping to guide product strategy to meet the needs of time-crunched legal teams looking to agree on contracts faster. What legal team is not time-crunched? Raise your hand if you're not, and you get a cookie because you're a unicorn. Okay, I don't know if unicorns like cookies, but that's what came out of my mouth today. So there we go. I've done too much talking today already. All right, with that, I will hand things over to Michael to get us started. Michael, take it away.
Thanks, Kate. Great to meet you all. I'm presenting to you tonight from a windy, wet, dark Scotland, but I'm delighted to kind of be talking to all of you about my favorite topic, which is AI. As Kate mentioned, I'm GC at Juro, which is an intelligent contract automation platform. That is one of two times that I'm going to talk about Juro tonight, because I'm actually here to talk to you about something extremely interesting to me as a recovering intellectual property, data privacy, and data and AI lawyer, and now in-house generalist. This is a topic super close to my heart. We're going to cover three things. Now, the first half of this, I'm very sorry, it's going to feel like CLE for software engineers. The second half is then pulling that information back into context. So we're going to talk about how what we then know about how AI works feeds into the key negotiation points that we come across every day as in-house attorneys. We've then got some time, as Kate said at the end, for live Q&A. If you've got questions as we go through, just pop them in the chat as well. I'll do my best to keep an eye on them, but Kate will interrupt me if there's stuff that's super pertinent that we can address early. Finally, Kate's done the housekeeping. There aren't any polls during the webinar. There's one at the end. Ask questions in the chat. There's some resources that we'll share afterwards. While I am a lawyer, I'm not your lawyer, so this isn't legal advice. And then we're done with the disclaimers, which is great. So yeah, this first half, I just wanted to talk a little bit in detail about how AI works. I've had the privilege of having been basically seconded to our AI engineering team at Juro for the last 6 months or so as we're building contract review agents. And so the first half of this talk is basically the summary of some of the information that I've been able to glean from them and how it's then influenced the way that I look at negotiating with AI-enabled software vendors. So some of this will feel very basic, some of it hopefully not. And then we'll use the kind of information that we learn in this half to inform the discussion about how we do the lawyering in the second half. AI is the ability of machines to perform tasks typically associated with human intelligence. Now, there's loads and loads of tests that you get for what is artificial intelligence. If you've heard of the Turing test, then you're probably 3 steps ahead of me. But this is basically what we're describing is technology and software in particular that resembles human intelligence in the complexity and the manner in which it performs tasks. So there's not like a kind of homogenized single definition of AI, but this is generally how people understand it and is sufficient for the level of detail that we as in-house attorneys need to know. I'm going to contrast in this talk programs or simple software from AI. Programs are the things that as commercial attorneys we've been used to dealing with for years and years. So that traditional track of learning how to negotiate SaaS vendor contracts or software license agreements is still very relevant. But the thing to remember is it's entirely based on old traditional software, right? And traditional software is a program written by a human that produces a reliable deterministic output. And what I mean by deterministic output is that kind of simple if-then logic. So if A, then B. That's basically the way that software works when it's written and coded by a human. So yeah, you get a user input, whether that's a click, a data entry through a keyboard. You might have data inputs from other systems, but they ultimately go into a program, which is then performing what is a kind of arithmetical calculation, and it produces a defined output. So you know that if you put A into the program, you get B out of it. AI is very different. So AI has at its heart models, and models produce flexible, probabilistic outputs. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I mean by that. So the user inputs in exactly the same way. Now, that might be your prompt into ChatGPT or something like that. You might also call on data inputs, so those systems that you've integrated with the AI software. You run those through an algorithmic model, and the model produces an output, and that output is probabilistic. Now, what that means is it's a kind of statistical inference from the thing that you've put into it. That's not quite the same as saying if A, then B, but what it's doing is predicting what the next thing might be after A. And that means that your output is less certain, but the tool that you've got is very much more flexible. So you can use it to generally achieve a wider range of tasks than you could with a simple line of code that's programmed by a human to do one thing. And the key thing about the model is it involves some kind of self-learning. And we'll get on to talk a little bit more about how that model is built and why that's important to understand when you're negotiating these AI vendor contracts. But the key thing here is that the output is different, right? And that's a very superficial difference between AI and conventional software programs. But to really understand AI and the risks that it presents to your business, you need to look under the hood. It's not enough to know that the outputs of using those tools are different. So I'm going to help you do a little bit of that. And this is stuff that I've learned from talking to AI engineers over the last 6 months and being embedded in those working groups and spending days at a time working on building AI software. As I said, software uses models to provide AI features. Now, you have to distinguish models from traditional software programs. Models are then integrated into software to power those kind of AI-enabled features. To really understand what a model is, you have to start looking at how they are made. And unlike a conventional software program, making a model is not just writing code. So conventional software, an engineer sits down, writes a few lines of code, and you have an executable program. When you're making a model, it's very different. You start with training data. So that's data that can be from basically any source. You generally want that to be relevant to the thing it is that you're building. Like the very largest models that are very famous, the GPT models run by OpenAI, models like Sonnet run by Anthropic, these massive large language models are trained on petabytes of training data. And what that is basically data that's mined from various sources. And the more data you have, in theory, the better the inferences that your algorithmic model can draw. Now, that training data to be usable is pre-processed. So you do some kind of, you execute some programs on that training data to make it usable by the model. You might also supplement that data with what's called synthetic data. So synthetic data is data that is generated for your training data by another AI model. We don't need to get into that too much here. But two processes generally happen. So the first is called tokenization. And what that is the breaking up of linguistic elements into small chunks. And you'll hear a lot about how AI tools use tokens, and tokens are the thing that OpenAI charges business to use, all that kind of stuff. But basically what it is, breaking up text of training data into usable chunks by the model. Those chunks are generally words, but they can be a bit shorter. In the English language, the average token is about 0.75 words, but it varies by language. And that process of tokenization basically allows that statistical analysis of language to happen by the model. If you've got tokens 1, 2, 3, and 4 of a sentence, you can then start to predict what tokens 5 and 6 might be. And you also get some cleaning. So you might find that there's bad data in there or data that is biased or like causes errors. And generally model developers will try to do some element of cleaning. And then the model itself is programmed algorithmically, and what it will do is conduct a process of self-learning. Now, it's beyond my ability to explain exactly how that works, right? But the process is basically that it will run tests on itself and will compare its answers against predicted outputs. And sometimes model developers might also involve like human people in verifying AI outputs, and those are also useful inputs into the training process. But basically, you end up with the final, in inverted commas, model, because they're always being developed, right? They're never really final. But you end up with the model that's being used by people being very far removed from a thing that is exclusively made by humans. And so you can see within that process, you've got data going in at one end, some kind of processing operations happening to that data to make it usable by the model, and then the model undergoing a vast and very kind of time, resource, energy intensive process of training itself. It's important to understand that process for two reasons. So one is you've got to understand the data inputs that go into that and when training happens and where. But the second thing is you've also got to understand that the resources involved in this mean that not everyone is making models, right? So models are not something that any software company can go and build. And so largely you're in a world where those models are being manufactured by very significantly funded companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, Meta, because other companies simply don't have the resources to do it. And for that reason, most software companies will buy rather than build AI models. And so this is important to understand when you're thinking about the flow through of liability from the person who's building the model to the ultimate user who's using the model. So there are basically three bases on which models are integrated into software providers' service offerings. And sometimes it's a combination of more than one of these. So the first option you've got is software vendor hosted. So the software vendor licenses a model from a model developer, runs it locally on the software vendor's own infrastructure, and then makes that software service available to the user. So the user is able to call on the software service to perform an AI-powered function. The software runs using the model locally on the software provider's own servers, and produces an output. An alternative is developer hosted. As a software company, you can go out and you can buy an API service from OpenAI, for example. And through that, OpenAI will host its own model on its own infrastructure. And there's a series of calls from the user to the software, and then sequentially from the software to the model. And that basically enables the software company not to have to stand up its own infrastructure that can be very expensive to run very resource intensive models. But doing that, you are giving up some control, right? So what the software vendor is doing in that circumstance is passing the data or the request from the user straight to the infrastructure of the model provider. Now, you can have contractual controls around what they can do there, but obviously the data is leaving your ecosystem as the software vendor. And then there's this kind of hybrid model that's also very popular at the moment as well, where larger kind of infrastructure providers like AWS or Google Cloud or Microsoft Azure will themselves license in models to run on their flexible infrastructure. And then you, as a kind of smaller software company, can buy effectively computing time or computing space within Microsoft Azure's environment, for example. And that's a kind of good hybrid, because basically you don't need, as the software vendor yourself, to stand up your own resources and infrastructure to host energy intensive models. But what you can do is call on the resources of a very large provider of kind of software infrastructure services to do that for you. And as I said, it tends to be a kind of mixture of the three, or maybe even just two of those. But it's important when you're buying an AI kind of powered service to understand exactly which of those is happening, because it has a direct impact on, for example, the level of comfort that you take from contractual assurances from your vendor, but also things like data privacy analysis, like where is this data actually ending up? Where is it being hosted? What could it be used for? And so those things are important to understand. And once integrated, users prompt AI to generate outputs via the software. This is stuff like if I'd spoken 18 months ago, comparatively few of us will have done this. And I think now if I were to poll the group here, I suspect a vast majority of us will have done this already. So you get a flow of data and from the user in the form of a prompt to the software. The software passes that prompt on to the model operates, whether that's on the software provider's own infrastructure, on the model developer's infrastructure, or on a third-party infrastructure. And then it produces an output that's piped back to the software, and the software serves that output to the user. So there's this kind of ecosystem of user, software provider, and model developer all working to produce the software that we're now getting used to using. Good AI needs context to work. So the models that software providers buy from model developers tend to be highly generalized, right? And that's necessary because those model developers are building those models for the mass market. It's very helpful to provide the AI with context to make it produce more accurate, more relevant results. Software vendors tend to do that through what are called system prompts. So a large amount of the engineering time of any software vendor is spent basically getting the model to behave in the way that the software vendor wants it to behave. So that might be something in like my context, a legal technology context, where the software is telling the model, you are a helpful contract drafting assistant for attorneys. You respond in a polite but direct and professional manner. That is starting to give context to the way in which the model responds. And those system prompts tend to be built into the software, so you can't see those as a user. But that's a lot of the challenge of a software vendor in providing the service in a way that's relevant to users. I'm going to pause there while Kate has popped up.
Yeah, we had a question that was immediately about the slide that you were just on, so I wanted to bring it up while it was relevant. They said the slide that showed the prompts going all the way back to the model developer, does that change when the software provider is providing a walled garden for their user, i.e., not sharing inputs with the underlying AI model provider?
Yeah, correct. So if I go back to this diagram, for example, you'll see that the prompt effectively only makes its way up to the third party vendor because the model is running locally on those servers. So there's effectively a break in the chain between the third party and the model developer. I tend to look at these third party hosted structures and the software vendor hosted structures as ones that make me feel inherently more comfortable about providing data up the chain. I think when you start with this version of events, so the developer hosted version, there is at least the physical ability of someone at the model developer to do something other than provide the service to you with your data. So we'll get on a bit later to talking about the contractual approach to that. But the practical approach is also really important. So the way in which your vendor has deployed AI within its tools is important in how comfortable you might feel about your most sensitive data flowing up the chain. But yeah, really great question. And certainly one that we looked at very closely when we were building kind of AI stuff at Juro. So we spoke a little bit about context and how software vendors try to build that context into the way that AI models are deployed. The software providers they really want your feedback and to perform analysis to improve those system prompts. So we're now getting used to seeing this kind of question coming back from our software when it generates an AI answer. And actually, that's a really useful piece of information for the software vendor because the software vendor is trying to refine those system prompts in the background. So they're trying to understand, is what they've done working for you, the user? Now, that is not the same as contributing information to training data, which we spoke about in the model development process, which is something that's done by the model developer. This is helping the software engineer refine the way those models are deployed to produce an accurate and useful output. So software providers want your feedback. They also want to analyze the way that you're using the system to help improve those system prompts and make it better. You will see those kind of requests feeding through in terms, but also in the way that the platforms operate. So that kind of thumbs up, thumbs down functionality is a very common way of seeing that. The other way that AI gets context is through connecting user data. Generally, these software companies are buying highly generalized but very well-trained models that have been developed using petabytes of generalized data. Where those models are operating in a way that is purely predictive and purely based on the data they were trained on, you are likely to get an output that is either inaccurate or constitutes a hallucination. And there are things that AI engineers do through connecting user data to make those outputs more accurate, more relevant, and more reliable. And that comes through connecting user data. So when you do that, you can do something called RAG, which is retrieval augmented generation. And in systems that use RAG, the model calls on the software when the software makes a request to it and says, is there anything software that you can provide to me that will help me put this in context? The software will then call a connected user data system. So that might be an internal intranet, your company Notion page, whatever you've connected up to that software, and will look for resources that are relevant to the inquiry that the model is servicing. The software will then feed that back to the model, and the model will use that to generate a more relevant result. I like to think of it as a combination between the kind of generative probabilistic capabilities of AI and search. So it's basically combining search and the kind of AI stuff to produce a much more relevant output. And so actually you'll find perhaps more so than traditional software, AI software is often calling for you to connect up other systems. Now, that carries risks that we all know about as lawyers, but it also carries opportunities, right? So you can get to a position where your software is producing something that is much, much more valuable to you because you have connected to it user data. What it then means is obviously you're exposing a larger amount of data to that software vendor. So you need to understand more about that back end and where where that data ends up going. And the contractual restrictions around that become important. But what I would say is connecting data is not necessarily a bad thing. RAG is a very good thing for producing reliable, useful output. But as I mentioned a bit earlier, models are hungry for more training data. And this is a kind of a thing that you tend to see more in like freemium models of AI software. You're the user and you're paying nothing to use the software. I think there's an overused phrase, which is if something's free to use, then you're the product. I think that's probably also quite true for a lot of AI products on the market. Model provider might be looking for other ways to generate relevant training data to feed that hunger for data. And so you'll see often in these kind of free to use models, free to use kind of software programs, a condition of that free use will be the software is able to take the data you put into it and contribute it back to a training data set. That carries risks, right? And those are the risks I think that as lawyers trained to look at software terms, we're often hyper focused on, and with very good reason. But let's talk a little bit more about that later. They also want fine tuning. So fine tuning basically happens at two stages. When we talked about training a model, there is some fine tuning that goes on in that process. So the model developer will, as part of the learning process, maybe provide human input, say have humans review some outputs and identify them as right or wrong. That process is called fine tuning. But fine tuning might also mean something different. And that's what I'm going to talk about here. Fine tuning might mean that the software vendor itself is trying to refine the way that it asks the model a question. I'm trying to think of a good example to give you here, but one might be the software provider wants to make the model in the context in which it's deployed in your software contextually aware of the other data that the software knows about you. And that, again, can be extremely useful in producing accurate, reliable, useful outputs. But again, you need to understand the basis on which that fine tuning is happening. When we talk about fine tuning, are we talking about contributing to a training data set? Or are we talking about software vendors effectively refining their system prompts in a way that doesn't result in the data being retained by the model developer? And I think the AI industry is maybe a little bit guilty about using fine tuning in both senses of the word. And so it's very hard to work out what you mean if you're going into a contract negotiation saying, I don't want my data used for fine tuning. Do you mean I don't want my data used to contribute to a training data set? Or I don't want the software vendor using using extra context to provide more relevant output that doesn't result in that data being more generally available. So look, I kind of spoke for about 25 minutes there about the technology behind it. That's a very kind of high level summary. That's what I call like the lawyer level summary. I don't pretend to understand much more than that. But I think that context is super useful when trying then to think about how to deal with AI software vendors when it comes to contract negotiation. I've extracted 5 hot topics that come up in AI contracts, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how the interaction between what we've just learned and traditional SaaS approaches will mean that we need to be a bit different in the way that we approach them. There are definitely other topics. So this is not an exhaustive list. These are just 5 that I thought were particularly interesting. And we'll spend a little while talking through these, and then we'll do some Q&A at the end if there are further questions as well. Quality warranties are extremely difficult with AI. As long in the tooth SaaS attorneys, I think lots of us are used to the very normal formulation you see here on the left, which is getting a warranty, maybe a rep from the service provider, that there's conformity with a specification, the vendor will act in a professional and workmanlike manner, and that the software will generally be free from material defects that might prevent the services from functioning properly. With AI, because you're dealing with probabilistic outputs, it's very difficult to say whether those warranties could ever be proven to be right or wrong. And I call for a slightly different approach with this. And I think that this is, and I might come across as slightly biased as working for a kind of AI powered SaaS company, but there are definitely things in here that just are no longer relevant when you're dealing with probabilistic rather than deterministic outputs. In a deterministic world where you're using a software program that's simple logic, if A, then B, you know that software program, if you put in A and it doesn't produce B, it's wrong. With an AI program, when you put in A and you get C, that might be right because it might be the most likely output, even if you would look at that with a traditional software lens and say, no, that should be B. And these traditional notions around freedom from defects and that prevent the services performing as described is very difficult, right? Because most of these software vendors will look and say, look what you're dealing with. You're dealing with AI. AI is never exactly 100% precise. And there's also lots of things to do with like how you use it. The other thing that vendors will point out to you is this how you use it point, right? Which is the output that you get is a product not only of an algorithm that is developed by a model developer that is not your vendor. It's a product of system prompts that are developed by your software developer, but also completely flexible inputs provided by the user. So if you think about using ChatGPT, no one is sitting there restricting what you can do with that software in the way that you would with clicking a button in a traditional software program. And so your ability to influence the accuracy of or usefulness of your result is vast. And so I would be very surprised if there are many AI vendors out there that are happy to, for example, provide an accuracy SLA. If you came to a software vendor and said, I want you to provide a service level commitment that the outputs from your tool are 90% accurate. Firstly, that won't be possible. And secondly, the one thing I've discovered working so closely with AI engineers in the last 6 months is actually the question of what constitutes accurate is a very deep rabbit hole. So are you talking about accurately understanding your prompt? Are you talking about accurately applying the system prompts? Are you talking about accurately running the algorithmic process that produces a probabilistic output? Or are you saying the output must mean the same thing as traditionally accurate output? Or you're saying the output must be worded in exactly the same way? All of those things cause problems when you go in as an attorney and say, I want an SLA around accuracy. Because I think if you say that and you ask for it, what you're doing is showing that you don't understand the way that AI software works. So all is not lost, though. So I think there are things that we can do as attorneys. So the first is commercial optionality. So if you're a buyer, you're acting for a software buyer, your ability to walk away from a deal with an AI software vendor doesn't have to be about it being someone else's fault. And where you're struggling with questions about how do I work out whether AI software is accurate or not, maybe your best option is, can I get a trial? Can I do a 3-month trial and see if it works or see if I can get my head around it? Can I play with it before I buy it? Like that kind of commercial optionality is extremely valuable. And so there's a temptation to over lawyer, to make it all about the ability to sue someone if it turns out to produce inaccurate results. But actually, what you really want in that situation is not to be committed to something that's not working for you. But equally, the software vendor will be quite entitled to think that you might you have to do some things yourself to get good outputs. And so, yeah, commercial optionality is your friend. The second is also considering more general warranties. So the warranty that we had in that traditional quality warranty there in the middle in B, performing the services in a professional and workmanlike manner, absolutely do that. Think about things like good industry practice, reasonable skill and care, things like that that are less pegged to objectively, is this output right or not? You're really talking about, is the vendor providing me with a quality service that if I use it correctly, it will function in the way that's described? Or is the vendor providing something that's substandard? And so I think those kind of general warranties rather than very specific points around output accuracy are probably the way to go with AI vendors. The second thing is that traditional expectations on IP ownership don't work in AI. They don't work for a few reasons, but the main reason is that many jurisdictions require IP protected works or inventions to have a human author or inventor, and AI outputs to some extent don't have that. And so you may find, this is a clause taken from OpenAI's enterprise terms, you may find these kind of wiggle words in purple as between you and OpenAI, and to the extent permitted by applicable law, you own the output. And the reason for that is OpenAI can't give you something that doesn't legally exist. And so I think these might be carve-outs that you're not used to seeing in traditional SaaS contracts, right? Where you're like, I put my data in, it performs a function, the data that comes out is a derivative of my original data, and therefore I own that. But it's not quite the same with AI. And there's not much you can do here in terms of contract drafting, but what you can do is do two things. So one is don't try to force an IP position that is legally impossible. So don't try to assert ownership of something that the law says you can't own. But this is the key point, and it's not really a contract point. Be aware of those risks and operationalize them. If you're reliant on this software for producing the most valuable proprietary assets in your business, you as the kind of attorney need to be thinking about, how do I involve a human in this enough to give me valid and subsisting IP rights? And that's not really a contract question, right? Because your AI vendor is never going to sit there and say, yeah, I'm going to guarantee you the subsistence of IP in the output from my tool. But you as the attorney can do your job of advising the business to work out methods of using these tools that involve sufficient human originality and creativity so that you own the IP and the thing it is that you're going to use. The third thing is indemnification. This kind of exists in a new reality in AI. I would say that definitely English lawyers like me and US attorneys, we definitely have different approaches to indemnification, but I think we tend to agree on things when it comes to like third-party IP claims. So indemnification traditionally reflected vendor control in the software development process. So vendors were exclusively in control of the job of writing software code for their software. And when they licensed that software to you, particularly with on-premise software, and you ran it on your servers and replicated it, you were entitled to rely on assurances from them. That software didn't infringe third-party IP rights. Vendors no longer have that control in an AI world. So the practical realities we spoke about when it comes to the resources required to train and build models means that the vast majority of software vendors out there offering AI solutions are doing so using models that are developed by someone that is not them. And that generally means that they are more reluctant to offer traditional warranties, particularly about the output from their traditional indemnification, particularly about the output from their tools. This example in inverted commas from Lovable, the popular vibe coding tool for building kind of websites and apps, actually doesn't contain any indemnification for the customer at all. No, seriously, it doesn't. And so you look at that and you think, oh, is this a special case because Lovable is an AI solution and AI is different? I don't think so. I'd suggest two things here. So one is understand that software vendors are not as in control of their software as they used to be. So they might feel nervous about offering traditional uncapped IP indemnities for things that are out with their control. And you might find yourself hitting up against a brick wall if you're trying to argue for them. And they're probably forced into that position by their insurers. So their insurers will be sitting there saying, look, if you can't back to back this risk with the model developer, and often they can't, then you need to limit it in some way. And as pragmatic attorneys, we can look and say, actually, what's the real risk to my business? Am I the end user of a software tool that is a customer of the model developer here really going to be on the hook for something that's done at the model training stage in the development of the software? Or am I so far removed that what we're talking about is a very remote risk? So there's definitely some pragmatism that buyers counsel can exercise there. But equally, AI is not an excuse to avoid normal protections completely. So the Lovable example is a really good one where they've taken an extreme approach, right? Which is to say, I'm an AI tool and therefore you don't get indemnification. That's not right. So there are large chunks of Lovable software that are exactly traditional software, right? Someone wrote the front end UI of Lovable, and that is something that they should be able to stand behind, even if the models they are using in the back end are necessarily produced by someone else who is market dominant and unable to offer or unwilling to offer them traditional protection the other way. So I would always ask for traditional indemnification protections, even if you end up having a carve out for the output itself or for things that have gone on in training. And finally, penultimately, IP licenses unlock both value and risk with AI vendors. I think I spoke a little bit earlier about how model developers have this hunger for extra training data. Software vendors have this hunger for feedback and analytics that will all help them to make their tools work in the way that they hope that they will work. And I'm going to make the slightly controversial argument that improvement isn't a dirty word in IP licensing, but it's really important to understand the detail before kind of diving in and negotiating or just going ahead and agreeing to stuff. This example I'm showing you on the slide is an example from OpenAI's terms. Now, these terms are the free to use terms for OpenAI. So if you create a free to use ChatGPT account, these terms apply. And what they say is basically OpenAI may use your content to provide, maintain, develop, and improve their services, and that you can exercise a specific opt-out with respect to training only. So other forms of improvement are permitted. But that's quite a common position in what I described earlier, those freemium terms, right? I am using something that is free. I am the product. My data is helping them to build something that they can then commercialize later. I want to draw a contrast between that and the position that you get if you buy a business or enterprise subscription to an OpenAI product. So OpenAI says in its terms that they will not use your content to develop or improve the services unless you explicitly agree. So there are things you can opt into with betas and all that kind of stuff where you could agree to submit your data for improvement. But you can see here that value exchange in stark reality, right? If you pay for ChatGPT, you get control over your data. If you don't, and I have some sympathy with that position, right? These vendors are investing vast amounts of capital to build useful tools, and they're entitled to ask to be paid. And if that payment is in cash or in data, that's okay. The key for us as attorneys is understanding. And one of the things I learned as AI was becoming a thing over the last 2 years was that actually the really important thing for us as a business was to make properly licensed tools available to the business to use to bring AI into the way that we operate it. And then I would just pause on this point to say one final thing. I think if you're dealing with a slightly more specialist software vendor that incorporates AI, you can very reasonably ask questions around the improvement that's taking place using your data, because that might well be something that's incredibly useful to you, right? You might be an early stage customer going on a journey with a vendor. And actually, if what they're doing is some engineers in the back are taking a look at things that you report errors with and trying to draw inferences from them for the system prompts, and they're happy to commit to keeping your data confidential and not exposing it to third parties, then that's fundamentally a good thing, right? And you might unlock significant value for your own business in kind of participating in that way. Now, I know we're not all charities, right? We're not here to help AI businesses become good. But ultimately, if AI businesses that are powering business critical operations at your company become good, then that has a net benefit for your business as well. Tips for this one, like not all improvement or development is bad. Some of it is hugely valuable, as I've said, but just understand what's being asked and think critically about it. As lawyers, we're used to poking the right points and asking questions around, is what I want to do here to be able to sue the vendor for misusing my customer data, or is what I want here really to enable the vendor to create a great service for me, but keep my data secret and protect it from being exposed? That might be possible, right? You just have to ask. And the second thing is buy the right plan. So I have huge sympathy with the free to use model operated by some of these large companies. And it's a reminder for those in risk functions in business to really look out for that shadow IT that exists in our organizations to make sure that we're protecting valuable business data. And that might be by spending a bit of money. And then the final point I had on my list of 5 was to watch out for emerging regulation. Those who are into flags might have spotted the Centennial State here, Colorado, as an example of a state in the US that has already passed state level AI regulation. The EU flag beneath it as well is flagging that the EU is now a regulated territory when it comes to the deployment of AI. And actually, it's a huge topic, right? And regulators are all over it. It's very important to think about where you are deploying your AI tooling, even if it's only something you use internally, in case you engage those regulatory regimes. There's also, I find, a bit of a tendency, which is these new AI specific regulations are popping up all over the world. And there's a tendency to think, oh, I'm using AI, I must consider AI regulation. But actually, you also need to think about other regulations that are relevant, that are not specific to AI. Things like data privacy, whether it's CCPA, do not sell stuff, or whether it's sector specific, HIPAA, things like that are going to be very important in the rollout of any AI project. And so, in terms of tips, I think I had a couple here. The first was thinking very strictly about data sharing and repurposing. So, using data for another purpose, whether that's training data or whether it's improvement. If your data includes personally identifiable information, or in particular, kind of higher risk categories of that information. If you're using a software tool to manage healthcare records, maybe that isn't the tool that you want to help contribute to a training data set with. And so it's very important that you dig into how that tool operates. Where is the data being processed? Is it at the software vendor level? Is it at the third party level? Or is it at a model developer level? And what are the contractual restrictions on how that data can be used? The second is really another call to step outside the contract for a moment. Consider the steps that you need to take outside the contract to roll out AI tools in compliance with applicable laws. So often that requires us to do, software engineers always tell me that their process for security is to shift left. So and what that means is to get earlier in the process. And I think there's something to learn there for lawyers as well. So the earlier we can be involved in the process of selecting a vendor or trying to solve a problem for the first time, the more influence we can have when it comes to ensuring compliance with regulation. And so I would encourage us all as in-house lawyers to take the time to sit with other business departments to understand what's their strategy for the year, what's their technology strategy, how they're going to do that, and identify those risks early. Because if you're the person that kind of saves your business investing hours and lots of money into investigating a tool that ultimately can't be used in compliance with regulations that apply to your business, then there you're delivering significant value. Equally, if you're the lawyer that unlocks a technology because you are able to deal in those emerging regulations, then you're also hugely valuable. So that is about all I wanted to say about AI and the interaction with how you negotiate AI vendor contracts. And there are definitely infinite number of topics that we could talk about on top of the 5 that I called out. But I wanted to head into the Q&A with these 3 takeaways. So one was just the acknowledgement that although your software still looks the same, AI is radically different from traditional software in the way that it works and how it's built. The second is that as skilled attorneys, we need to be able to respond to those differences. But to do that, you need to understand the tech enough to know when to hold firm and when to push. And the third, I think it's kind of the same point I made on an earlier webinar that I did for IHC, right? Which is that lawyering doesn't begin and end at the contract. It's not even half the story. So legal can bring value to the whole process. So if you shift left, you can get involved in that whole thing, from strategy to vendor selection to contracting to then rollout and deployment. And all of those things are equally important when you're dealing with the risks that are presented by AI, but also the huge value and opportunities. So that's where I was going to pause. And Kate has emerged as well, just in time. I think we've got some time for some questions.
Yes, emerged from my cave, my muted Zoom cave. Yes, I did have a ton of questions, so I will go through them with you now. Let's see here. Okay, so the first question was, do you see the future where there are LLM type models and then customers use supplement training to specialize the model to their particular needs?
So partly, I say partly for 2 reasons. So one is that's not the future, that's now. So there are definitely services out there where you can do that. The second thing I was going to say is that actually, again, it's very important to understand the context and the technology. When you're dealing with a large language model, I think when I first spoke about ChatGPT about 2.5 years ago at a conference, it had already been trained on a petabyte of data. If you don't know what a petabyte is, I strongly encourage you to go and Google it, but it's a serious amount of data. And I think I'm always skeptical about the ability of an individual software vendor or a customer to influence the way that those LLMs fundamentally work by performing their own very small scale training. If you think about the average in-house legal department might have 1,000 contracts. The data that goes into training the GPT models is the equivalent of billions of contracts, right? So you're trying to think about how you do that. I think what people really mean when they're talking about like training for their own purpose is they really mean that kind of process of either system prompting, buying software that or building software that is instructed by them in how to operate. Or what you might be thinking about doing is how do I make the LLM contextually aware of my own data? And so you can do that through things like RAG, right? So if you connect that data into your software in a way that works, you can basically augment the output from the model using your own data. And that is hugely valuable. Again, usual health warnings apply, right? Know where the data is going, all that kind of stuff. But actually, that done really well can result in hugely valuable output. And also, you can do that in a relatively safe way, right? So you can do that through your software vendor providing access to the model in a safe third-party environment. And that's a hugely impactful way of getting access to much better outputs. The final thing I would say is like when we as mere software vendors or anyone else as a mere user talks about the ability to train or refine a model produced by one of the mega tech companies to make it work in a particular way, one of the battles we are always fighting is the next version of that model that's going to be released or a new model that's going to be released that operates in a radically different way. And a lot of software vendors like us are running around trying to keep up with OpenAI at that point when they release ChatGPT 5, and then suddenly things that you worked in your system prompts yesterday no longer work today. And I would always caution against investing time and effort in doing something that's very almost training or coding related, but rather invest your time in thinking about, okay, how do I structure my data in a way that I can make it accessible as context for other models to run on it. That way you're also not tied to a particular vendor or a particular model, which is quite a nice bonus.
I love a bonus. No, great answer. And since you brought up RAG in that answer, we also had a question about RAG, which is, does RAG change the model or does it merely use it?
So the latter, it merely uses it. So the model itself is a thing, and basically what it's doing is helping the model to identify the way it needs to augment or change its output. The way that users use AI tools doesn't fundamentally change the model. The model is the model and it changes itself over time as it learns. But yeah, it's generally, I think of it in those two stages. The model's doing its thing and saying, I want to generate this output because it's the most statistically likely output that I know. Is there anything that I can look at through RAG that gives me an indication of whether that's right or not? Or can I link to a source using RAG? That's the other cool thing that you start to see in more recent tools.
Okay, an answer was given to this in the chat, but I wanted to get your feedback as well. Someone asked, can you say more about how an enterprise account trains within the enterprise's account versus the LLM in general?
So there's a few things going on there. I think the question is basically when I'm an organization and I've got, for example, a business subscription to ChatGPT, and I enable ChatGPT to draw on a large context window of my business's information, what's going on there. Often, and I think the best example to go on this is like your chat history. If you've got a ChatGPT account and you use it to work, ChatGPT will store your chat history and then it will call on that in answering future queries, right? So it becomes over time contextually aware of what answers do you like, what answers don't you like, all that kind of stuff. And generally, and this is with a huge asterisk and disclaimers all over the place, but generally the way that kind of general purpose AI tools work when you have got like an enterprise subscription would be through something like that. So you might have an enterprise level version of that. Your tool is becoming aware of how users across your enterprise are using it and slowly building better context. But again, delve deep into the terms and the way the tool works, right? Because you need to find that out for the specific tool that you're asking about and the specific setup that you're using. And again, that feels like something you traditionally as a lawyer would have delegated to IT security or something like that. But it's becoming more and more relevant to the lawyers to get into the detail.
Yeah, that's interesting about the chat history using, because I know one of the issues that people have with chat GPT and these models is that it can be sycophantic, like it just wants to please you. And so it's interesting that it knows what you like and it's going to try and give you more of what you have liked and appreciated in the past.
There's one interesting actually a feature of ChatGPT if you have got an account is that you can go into your system preferences and you can input your own system prompts. So ones that are not held by ChatGPT. So you can go into your account and you can say, I have this set up, which is I don't need you to please me. I just need you to answer the question directly and openly and tell me what you don't know. So you can do stuff like you can pre-calibrate ChatGPT so it doesn't give you those sycophantic responses. If you like the sycophantic responses, keep going.
If you just want someone to tell you all the things you want to hear, then great. You got it in ChatGPT if that's how you want to operate. Maybe not the best for lawyers. We need to hear no sometimes. So someone asked if this was on slide 25, just in case we need more context here, but are there specific good industry practices that we can call out in a warranty?
So I think if we're talking about the quality warranty, it's a really good question. It depends the service that you're buying, right? Because I think when I start to think about like industry standards for AI, they're developing. So I think it's very difficult to point to one and say, you know what, I want my model to have been developed with a particular AI ethics framework in mind. So that kind of thing might start to become more interesting, particularly as we get a longer track record of regulation in Europe, for example. So Europe will start to require, in fact, is already starting to require developers of general purpose AI models to include disclosures about how things are trained and things like that. I would think it is very sector specific. So I would always kind of look and say, what is it I want this tool to do? So if it's like an AI accounting software tool, you might point to it and say, I want it to comply with good industry practice in the professional trade of accounting software. But you might get more specific than that if there are particular accreditations that are relevant to your sector or industry or the sector or industry of the vendor. That's not really an answer, I'm sorry, but hopefully that's helpful.
That's an answer. I think someone else just asked, can you pre-calibrate ChatGPT not to make up an answer when it doesn't have one? And someone said no, but I don't know.
It's very difficult to do it successfully. I definitely ask my own one to tell me when it doesn't know the answer, and it doesn't always.
Just like human lawyers, it doesn't like to admit when it doesn't know something. It's a skill that we all need to learn, is admitting.
I might just be mirroring my own chats to myself. So
you're like, no, I will never admit when I don't know it. So just a couple more questions and then we will let you go. But so since these enterprise AI agreements are fairly new and cover risks like AI output errors and IP claims, are the contracts firms receive today mostly standardized and non-negotiable, or is there significant room to negotiate better terms?
So again, lawyer answer, it depends. So I think if you're going in and hoping to negotiate with Anthropic or OpenAI or Google or Microsoft, at that end, no. I think at the software vendor level where they're incorporating AI products into their tools, it's a question for you and probably one of negotiating power. I would say that like as a software vendor, like I tend to stop at the points at which I, am being asked to promise things we don't do or am being asked to give assurances we can't give. But your ability to push for extra coverage kind of depends on that bargaining power generally. I would just say that those kind of software companies in the middle will have other constraints, right? So it will be what's insurable and actually interestingly, one of the questions that I get asked as we go through our corporate insurance renewals every year is to talk about the way that we manage liability for AI outputs in our contractual terms with customers. It might not always be the case that the lawyer is just being obstructive. If the answer is no, it might be that they've got like other stakeholders that are forcing their hand one way or the other. But again, if you're acting for Megabank Inc. and you're up against tiny software vendor at Series A, you might stand a very good chance of getting what you want. But if you're not, you might need to be pragmatic.
That makes a lot of sense. Yes, the power dynamics matter. Okay, one more question. And I know there were more questions, but I'm not going to get to all of them. Sorry. As I said, reach out to Michael if you still have a lingering question. So we've gotten this question before, and I cannot remember if it was on your last session or it was a different one. But basically, people are struggling with the fact that AI services are delivered sometimes through like multiple tiers of like vendors, subcontractors, cloud providers, all of that stuff. So what are the best practices for protecting confidential information when you have all of these tiers of providers, basically?
So There's only so much you can do in the contract. And so you will do what you always do, right? Which is look at the confidentiality provisions, look at the licensing provisions, look at the privacy provisions, and get yourself to a point where you're okay with that. After that, once the contract is signed, you're basically taking on trust and the way that works. Not only are you dealing with multiple layers with parties that you don't know, but you're also dealing often with software vendors that might be, they've been started in a San Francisco garage 3 weeks ago and they've got to 100 million in ARR and they're flying, right? They might not be good for the promises that they've made. And so there are risks there. I would say that the mitigation for those risks is always to work like hand in glove with your like security team or the people that do IT at your organization to really understand what the practical risks are. And it might be that the advice is go for that vendor that's slightly more expensive because they host the model themselves or they use Microsoft Azure. So there's a private server. OpenAI can't even get their hands on it if they wanted to. Like it might be that's the answer. But I would say that cross-functional collaboration becomes even more important at the point at which you're procuring AI software with multiple layers of people who you don't know.
All right. Thank you, Michael. I know you had have another slide about Juro upcoming events, so I want to give you a chance to show that. And while we do that, I'm also going to launch a little poll to see if anyone wants to learn more about Juro. So please discuss what's coming up here.
Thank you for coming. I said that I would say one more thing about Juro before I left. And that one more thing is that we have a wonderful community of thousands of lawyers at some of the most innovative businesses in the world. We run events as well. We've got one coming up later this month. If you want to see some AI software in action, AI Extract has changed my life and hopefully it could change yours as well. If you want to see more of that, do come along to our event on the 27th of November. But if you want to sign up to our community and see more of our events, do head over to juro.com/community and we'd be very happy to see you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you, Juro. And thank you to all of you for being here and for spending your time with us today. Hope that you have a great rest of your day and we appreciate you. And yeah, thank you, Michael, again. Any final thoughts?
No, at all. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.